I'm Diane Mervitz. I'm here with Antonia Dawson. We're here in Melbourne, Australia, and it's January 28th, 1997. Your name is?
Antonia Dawson.
And how do you spell that?
Both names you want spelled? Okay, A-N-T-O-N-I-A, D-A-W-S-O-N.
And when were you born?
21st of December, 1922.
And where were you born?
Vienna.
And how old are you now?
74.
Tell me a little bit about your childhood, about growing up in Vienna.
Well, I was an only child. I lived with my parents in a third-floor flat. But, I had... my parents were fairly quiet, shy people, so we didn't know many people, but I had a few childhood friends, partly through kindergarten and in the street. I knew a few people, and then at school, of course. I was very frightened the first time I went to school because I was such a sheltered child, but eventually I got over that, of course. Well, you want me to go right through to 38?
Well, I'll ask you what's your father's name.
My father's name was Siegfried, a very Nordic Germanic name.
And where was he born?
He was born in Romania, yes, but he was only a baby when they migrated or came to Vienna.
And do you remember when he was born?
89, 24th of May, 89.
And your mother's name?
My mother's name was Alice, but she always told me they made a mistake on the birth certificate or something and called her Aloysia, which she didn't like. So we'll say Alice. And she was born in October 1890.
And what was your mother's maiden name?
Schuss, a bit hard to pronounce.
And what was your maiden name?
My maiden name was Messing.
And when was your mother born?
On the 29th of October, 1890.
And where was she born?
In Vienna. Mm-hmm. So was her mother. They were already in Vienna.
And were you an only child?
Yes, that's what I said. I led a very sort of, well, sometimes I felt a bit lonely. You know, I used to go to my girlfriends and there was always lots of life and laughter and children and animals, even though they lived in a flat. And coming home, it seemed, you know, like a bit of a black cloud descending. But that was sort of, I suppose, my temperament, my father's temperament. Bit, well, not exactly depressed, but a little bit sort of negative. Why? Well, I don't know why. It was just a feeling. I really couldn't. Don't know, there was maybe some sort of feeling of isolation, of being different.
And what about extended family members, grandparents?
Well, I had my father's grandparents, so he was an only child, and they were not exactly child lovers. I wasn't very close to them. And there was my mother's father. He loved me and was good to me, and I enjoyed him. But the mother was dead before I was born, long before I was born. So I didn't know her. And there were two sons, the uncles. One was married briefly for 1 year, and the other one wasn't married at all, and they lived in the same flat as my grandfather.
Do you remember any of
with
their
a
names?
Housekeeper, yes. The uncles, Ernst and Maximilian, Max for short.
And your grandparents?
My grandparents, well, my father's mother was Helene and father Nathan. And my mother's father, on his birth certificate, it said Pincus, but they called him Philip.
And what about your mother's parents, your other grandparents?
Well, that's what I mean. That was my mother's father, Pincus Schuss. And the mother had died, long before. I think she died before the First World War. She died young, sort of heart trouble or something. So I didn't really know her except from stories that my mother used to tell me.
What about cousins and things like that?
Very, very a great dearth of cousins. Well, I didn't have any real cousins, like first cousins. I had this. My mother had cousins, and said only one of them had a child. So I don't know what she would be to me, my third cousin or something. That's the only one I knew, and didn't see a lot of her, but I knew her, and I met her again when we were refugees in England. And I sort of kept loosely in touch, but not a lot. She went to America later, and I came here.
And what did your father do for a living?
He was a consulting engineer with Siemens, a big firm of engineering. I'm sorry. And he was there all the time. I think he got the job before. Well, during the First World War, he wasn't taken in the army because of flat feet and some other minor disabilities, which he was very happy about, I think. And he was there until he was dismissed under Hitler, because of being Jewish, I suppose.
And did your mother work?
My mother didn't work in Vienna, no. Not as they call it here, gainfully employed. She did a bit of dressmaking, sort of, and she didn't.
And were you from a religious home?
No, quite the opposite. And what would you call it, an anti-religion or atheist? Well, my grandfather, my mother's father, was observant anyway, and he wasn't very happy about the way I was brought up, but that's how I was brought up, without any religious training. And of course, they had classes actually in Vienna for children who didn't belong, sort of just how to live, ethics, I suppose you'd call it, how to lead a reasonable life, that sort of thing. But in, when was it, 33, I think, there was what they call a putsch, a change of government, from the Social Democrats to the Christian Socialists, they call themselves. And they decreed every child under 14 must attend religious instruction. So I had to attend religious instruction. Now, which religion to attend? There was a priest at school who always wanted us to come, but we wouldn't. So anyway, I then joined the Jewish religious instruction. But the teacher was very fanatical, and he sort of got me out before the class, and he said, "Now, did you join us because of the new law or because of your convictions?" And I said, "Because of the new law." He wasn't very happy about that. But anyway, I was in that. He was not a good teacher. I mean, he just wasn't. That wasn't because of what religion he had. He just wasn't. The girls played up like murder with him. Lollies flew through the classroom, and it was terrible. But anyhow, he told me I had to catch up on 3 years Hebrew, and that was rather a big task, which was a bit formidable. And all around it wasn't a very successful time, so when I turned 14, I said goodbye.
Do you remember his name at all?
No, I'm sorry. He was a youngish man still. I vaguely remember his face, but not his name. No, I can't tell you. But then he was annoyed. He said to the girls, "Now don't you ever have anything to do with Toni," as they called me, again, because I'm a traitor to Judaism. And then time went by. I mean, I still had my friends, I didn't have many friends, but that we were still friends, and the others, well, as at school, you just see each other. And 4 years later, of course, the Germans marched into Austria, and before very long, they said all Jewish children must sit on one side of the classroom, all Aryan children on the other side. And so, of course, I had to sit there, and they were quite amazed. "Are you Jewish?" they said to me. They'd forgotten all about my career, my religious career or otherwise. So So that was, I remember that. Well, after that, we were a bit frightened because, you know, in the street sometimes I used to pick up, everybody had to wear a swastika except Jewish people. Of course, later on you heard they had to put a star, but that didn't happen then in Austria. But if you didn't wear a swastika, it was already a bit obvious. And so about April, no, was it March they came in, about May, I think I left the school altogether, because I wouldn't have been allowed to continue after the end of the school year. There was a Jewish school that still kept running, but again it was a bit dicey. We were probably a bit cowardly to go there, and I don't know what happened. My girlfriend did go for a while. She seemed to have been all right. Well, then we did all kinds of courses, what they called retraining, because we all wanted to emigrate and we wanted to acquire some skills.
I just want to bring you back a bit. We were talking about how you weren't from a religious home.
Yes, that's right.
Do you remember what happened when there were Jewish holidays? How did you observe them at home?
Well, we didn't. And I did, as I said, I felt a bit on the outer because I didn't belong anywhere. And the few people, there were other people, of course, like us, but there was no sort of real community or anything like that. And my neighbor, my friend there, well, they were fairly observant. And she sometimes tried to make me to come along to synagogue and so on. I think I went once or twice. But of course there it was sort of rather strange because the father was very observant, but he often was away on business. And the mother had relatives in Czechoslovakia who manufactured sausages that were not kosher. And so she used to come around in the morning and said, could she borrow our saucepans and plates to cook and eat the sausages? We thought that was a bit funny.
Did you ever question your parents as to why you didn't observe? Or?
Well, they didn't believe in God. They said, if you, although I know Jews, there's sort of a national feeling, but on the whole it was a religion, and they felt just like other religions. They just didn't believe in it, and they weren't going to go through the rituals of observing. That was what they told me. And I didn't sort of question much, except when I came to about 14, goodness knows why, I saw some film about a renegade priest and the terrible guilt he felt. And then I sort of had this, like I suppose children who are brought up in a religious home might have doubts, might feel, I wonder, you know. So I was the opposite. Maybe there is something, maybe it's, you know. So for a while there was a bit of soul searching. But then, as I said, a year after that Hitler came and we had more pressing worries. Yes, yes.
We were talking also about your schooling.
Mm.
I just want to ask you about the schooling that you went to. What type of schools did you go to?
Well, I went to primary school first, and in Austria at that stage, that was only 4 years, not 6 like it is here. And then you went to secondary school either for 4 years, or if you were lucky enough or could, you would go right through for 8 years to matriculation, which was a university entrance. So I went to this primary school, then 2 years in this secondary school, which were government schools. And, well, I wanted to go on, and my parents said, okay. So I went then to a private secondary school for 2 years, but then I couldn't finish because of what happened.
And what were you thinking of becoming? Or was there anything in your mind that you wanted to
Well,
do?
I was very interested in science, and I would have liked to study it, but I don't know whether I really would have been good enough for it, but I was interested then. But I lost more or less interest, you know, when all this happened with Hitler. We knew our very lives were threatened. We, you know, lost, as I say, our civil rights. I felt the main thing is if we could get out somewhere, and all our energies are mine. I tried to persuade my father, and he said, as long as I've got a job here, I can't move. Well then, when he lost the job, he saw the light, and well, took a long time, but we were lucky. Eventually got out.
And what about yourself? Did you have any hobbies or interests?
As a child, well, mainly I liked hiking and swimming, and my mother took me to the opera when I was fairly young, and I loved that. Music, that's about. And schoolwork, I was a bit lazy as a child. I got more interested as I grew older, but...
What about school friends? You said you had some friends before. Were they Jewish, non-Jewish?
Yes, actually, they were... No, I had two friends that were not Jewish, quite close, and the others were Jewish, yes. Actually, that last school I went to were 80% Jewish students, and I think the headmistress and some of the teachers. It wasn't a Jewish school, but a lot of them just happened to be Jewish. And as far as I remember, I lost touch, but I think most of them that I know of escaped, except my girl, another friend I met on holidays, and she was the only one who got out. Her parents and her sister did not get away.
And do you remember her name at all?
Rösler, yes, the family was called Rösler. Her name was Helga. And I kept in touch with her until she died a year ago.
And what about life before the war? I mean, besides the schooling?
Yeah, well, when you mean before Hitler marched into Austria, you mean? Well, in what way? I mean, we were, well, mainly because I was the only child, we were sort of comfortable enough, had a holiday usually in the country for 2, 3, 4 weeks. Mainly my mother and I. My father didn't like to, oh well, he had to work, but he didn't like to travel much. So they never did go out of Austria much, but we had holidays in the country. And my father had a cousin in the country, so we saw them occasionally. We visited there. And just, you know, I used to go skating in winter after school, that sort of thing. Just an ordinary life, really.
What about anti-Semitism in school?
Well, when I was, now what's that in the that was still in the primary school. There was a little bit, but it wasn't, you know, we didn't even take it seriously because, for instance, the priest told the children, you know, that the Jews crucified Jesus and the Jews are greedy. That sort of, that's gone on for centuries. But it wasn't all that. I mean, you weren't your life wasn't threatened, and you had your rights like everybody else, and it wasn't widespread. It was stirred up, of course, then. There was an undercurrent there in some sections of the community. But unlike perhaps the eastern countries in Austria, it wasn't, you know, unless you sort of happened to meet someone or looked for it, you could be quite living in a fool's paradise, shall we say, or quite oblivious. So one of the girls once asked me, said, "Is that true about the Jews having crucified Jesus?" and things like that. But, well, it must have been there earlier on, because my father, when he was young, I mean, couldn't get the job. And then they said, "Well, you get yourself baptized and we'll give you the job."
So did he?
So he did, yes. And then he left again later on. But
so what about teachers? You were mentioning the religious instruction teacher that you had before.
Don't think he had much teacher training, though, or the gift for teaching, because he just screamed and he couldn't handle a class. But what about other teachers?
As far as anti-Semitism?
No, no, I wasn't aware of anything. I did find out in that last school there were 2 teachers that were not members, I believe, of the Nazi Party, but never until Hitler actually came in. They come out in the open or made any differences. Nothing. No, stuck it there.
So what do you remember about the time when the Nazis came
I
into
remember
Austria?
just, as I say, until about 2 or 3 months before, I lived in a fool's paradise. We heard about Hitler. As far as I was concerned, Germany could have been as far as Australia. It just didn't register to me. I wasn't naturally sort of interested in politics, you know how. But then, about 3 months before, you heard these rumblings, and we went on a skiing holiday, and there were lots of groups, Sea Kyle and all. Oh yes, there was one incident when you said anti-Semitism. That was about, I think it was in 36 or 37. Went away on holidays with a Jewish family. My mother couldn't come, and they looked after me. And we were about 14 something, and we liked to start dancing. And there was a dance in a local inn or something like that, and we all went along, and after a while they said, "We don't want you Jews here." We were kicked out of the dance. So that was one incident, about 2 years or so before. Yes, I'd forgotten about that actually till you mentioned that. And a little remarks here and there, but as I say, nothing very threatening, and as it's been like that for hundreds of years, one just lived with it.
So we were talking about when the Nazis came into Austria, and what you remember
Yes.
at the time.
Well, then in Schuschnigg was then the, whatever they called him, prime minister or something. And they tried in last-minute efforts a united front, you know, to fight against Germany, but other countries had promised help, but nothing was happening. And they painted slogans on the footpath and everywhere, you know, Austria, and I forget the details, but anti-German, anti-Hitler. And then on this night, now I've forgotten the date, 12th of March, roundabout. They said the Ides, or roundabout the Ides of March. Well, they came with the planes, roaring all night, and marching and singing, Sieg Heil, Sieg Heil. Well, we knew we'd had it. And the very next day, how they knew where all the Jews lived, I don't know. But the next day, they're out in the street scrubbing off the Jews, some Jews, I mean, scrubbing off these painted slogans, and they broke into shops. And then we said, perhaps there was a blessing in disguise. We were so isolated, no one knew us. So nobody denounced us and said there's Jews living there.
Do you remember around what time of year or what year?
Well, it was March when they moved in.
And what year was it?
1938. Oh yes, I didn't forget that.
So besides...
And then the systematic sort of, it was very minor at first. For instance, in all the parks, it said no Jews are allowed to, it said Aryans only on the seats. And in the street, as I said, everybody then was given swastikas except Jews. And you just felt very insecure. And it was slow, sort of very slow. Nothing happened at first. My father still went to work. And we heard of so-and-so's son's been taken to camp, and someone else had been, but very little at first, and gradually it built up.
When you heard the term camp, what did you think?
Well, concentration camp. Well, we knew it. We didn't know, well, at that stage there weren't extermination camps, but we knew there wasn't exactly a picnic or a holiday. And so we heard reports of people being tortured as they queued up. They were at embassies for visas. Some were rounded up, and they tried to get confessions out of them that they are spies and this and that. And torture, real tortures. And what else? I thought of something then. Yes, I met one man. Now, I cannot remember who he was. As I said, before Hitler came, we didn't mix much, but of course with common worries we seemed to meet more people. And one man was taken to camp, and when he came out he was saluting everybody. He must obviously have been really traumatized terribly. He sort of hardly recognized anyone, and he saluted us and clicked his heels, that sort of thing. That was in the early months after. And of course there was talk of war, and what was the next country invaded was southern, the Sudetenland. That was late. Was that 38? I think that was late in 38. Well, before that, as I say, my father lost his job in July 38. And we also were told that that flat we were living in is now wanted by a high Nazi official, and we had to get out.
Do you remember the address?
Yes, it was, I don't remember the number of the flat, but it was number 4, Gussenbauer Gasse, and it was the 9th district in Vienna. It was not far from a railway station which was named after the Emperor Franz Joseph, and was near not the main Danube, but the canal that went off it. That was quite a nice spot as far as Vienna is concerned, because it was mostly 2-3 floor storied houses, flats, grey streets, unless you were lucky enough to live further up. Yes, so then, but they said, yes, we can have another flat that didn't have a bathroom or anything, a much smaller flat. We can stay there for a while. Well, we had no choice, so we did. And that's where we were when, in November 38, when that Kristallnacht occurred.
I just want to go back. Do you remember the address of where you were, the second flat?
That was the same block of flats, same address. It's just the flat numbers, I'm sorry, I don't remember, but I know there were over 30 flats in that house, so it would have been about 30 because it's upstairs, something like that.
I just want to ask you, what was your understanding of what was going on? Why was it happening to the Jews? Did anyone explain? Did you ask? Did you hear anything?
Why? I mean, we knew that anti-Semitism was as old as, as people came away from there, to Europe. That's it. Why? They were different. They didn't want to, different cultures. Intolerance was always, I think it's something in people, there's them and there's us. And I really can't does anyone have the real answer? Is there one? I don't know.
I think we'll end this tape now. Tape 2 interview with Antonia Dawson. I want to ask you, with all this going on, did your parents ever talk about immigrating?
Well, once my father lost his job, yes. Before that, he said, oh, it won't get so bad, it's all, that'll all blow over. I wanted to get out straight away. But we couldn't. We had no relatives anywhere, and as far as my father was concerned, United States was out. A lot of people got there because he was born in Romania. They had a quota system, and the Romanians were right at the bottom of the quota. It might have had to wait 20 years. But we did, yes, and then he started to write here and there, and everybody had some information on something. And yes, that was our main occupation, really, to find a way to get out.
So your father wasn't a citizen of Austria at the
time?
Oh
yes. Well, not once. Once we lost our citizenship too. We lost our rights. We were made stateless. When I was at school before Hitler came, there were a couple of children from Poland who were stateless, and I thought, oh, that must be awful. I didn't quite know what it meant. So we were stateless now. But they didn't go by citizenship, but where you were born in America. So that was our, don't know how he got on to writing to Australia, and he applied for Australia, but he was already in his late 40s, I think. And then they said he was too old, or else you had to bring in a lot of money, which we didn't have. So that was refused after 9 months. Well, that's a long time went by. I was 39 by then, 1939, early. And, you know, the rumblings of that war might come was getting closer. I think Hitler marched into Sudetenland in late 38 and then took over Czechoslovakia early 39, as far as I remember. After he had no more territorial aims, as a famous saying went.
And you mentioned before about Kristallnacht.
Yes.
How did that time affect your family?
Well, it happened allegedly because this German diplomat was shot in Paris, and the reprisals took place the next day. They rounded up only the males at that time, male Jewish people, and that was the time this family friend, who was a very devout Catholic, she had contacts, I think, with various Nazis. She knew what was going on, and she knocked on our door at 6 in the morning, and she said to my father, "You are coming with me. You got to come with me, or else." And he did. And she hid him all day in different places. I don't know. I don't remember where. So when they came to our flat, we said we didn't know where he was. And they didn't do anything much to us, except they said, "What are all those suitcases? You're going away soon." Yeah, nothing much. And then I went next door to my girlfriends, and they came there, and her brother had been taken to camp from one of those queues. Earlier on, he was already in camp. And they took the typewriter. They said, "You may have written some subversive material, and we want to X-ray the typewriter." But they didn't do anything else to us, luckily. We were terrified, of course. And then by 10 in the evening, the lady came, as my father said, "It's been called off. The whole action is now called off for the moment." So she brought him back.
Do you remember
and
the lady's
every
name?
other Jewish male in that flat was taken to camp, so he was lucky.
Do you remember the lady's name?
Yes, Tilde was her first name, and Selberherr was her family name. And she was also a very close friend of my uncle's. Actually, she looked after one of them who died at home still. He had cancer, which is not nice, but he missed out a much worse death, I think. And she wrote us a letter after the war about the other uncle. He was a doctor, and he tried out something with morphia, became addicted, and he became quite ill, and Hitler was already there, but he was taken to a hospital, and they cured him sort of that. And she wrote and said, "If I'd known what was ahead of him, what they cured him for, I would have let him die." And he was then transported. I think it was one of the extermination camps. I think it was Auschwitz.
So how long was your father away for?
Just the day, early morning till about 10 at night.
And when he came back, did he tell you what
Oh,
had happened?
well, he told us that he was taken to a family that had a house on the outskirts in the cellar. He sat there a while, and then they thought that wasn't safe, and they took him somewhere else. Various people that this lady knew.
And yourself?
Well, we were frightened, very frightened, but we just sat there. I mean, we couldn't do anything.
What was going on in Vienna, do you remember?
I never thought we would actually survive all this. You know, I knew that day was over, but we didn't think we'd ever get out. But then finally, well, my parents just decided to go to Shanghai, which was the only place in the world you could go without a landing permit or a visa. All you had to have is the money for the tickets, which were black market. By then, luckily, had saved up enough. And I'd applied, you know, this girl, my friend, one of my school friends, when did she get to? Early 39, I think she got to England on a children's transport. They were organized by, I'm not sure, was it refugee organizations, and a lot of Jewish children were taken to England and sort of billeted with different families. And she was billeted with a nurse, and she then said, I'm going to get you out. I'm determined to get you out. And then 2 or 3 others, she wrote to me. And she did. She got me a permit. I mean, the people got me the permit, but they helped me. So thanks to her, I got to England just shortly before the war started.
I just want to go back a bit about Kristallnacht. In the streets, besides the males being taken away, what else, do you remember anything else going on at that time?
Didn't dare go out in the street that day. We just said stay inside.
Did you hear anything going on? Did anyone come and tell you?
Oh, well, our neighbors came and said so-and-so has been taken to camp, and, you know, people were taken to police stations, some of them. Some had water poured down their stomachs, and all horrible stories, but we didn't go out, so we just, it was very frightening, and we were just damn lucky.
So now you're talking about going to England, and you said a friend of yours. What was her name?
Judith Meyer.
And she was a school friend?
Yes, I went to school with her, yes.
So you were going to England, or you were trying to?
Well, I was trying to, and everybody said, oh, Shanghai is terrible, and a lot of diseases, and if you can get to England, it'd be better for you, but so we tried hard.
So your parents now were talking about going to Shanghai?
Yes.
And how did you feel about the fact that you were going to immigrate without your family?
Yes, well, you know, it's a funny thing. I can't remember the exact feeling. I was supposed, partly, well, being young, I thought if we can only get out, it was like an adventure. And I sort of said, will I ever see them again? But I somehow thought, you know, I wasn't too bad about that. And I knew I had sort of friends in England. I thought I wouldn't be completely alone. So in a way I was quite excited about it, just if we can just get out in time. And, oh well, when I got on that plane, it was the most fantastic feeling I've ever had. I've never been on a plane anyway, but you know, you lift off and you're out. I couldn't believe it. It was wonderful.
So at the time that you were going, were your parents still in Vienna?
No. 2 weeks, well, we ummed and we ahed and we agonized. Should they go and leave me there? What if I don't get out? But I said, get out, get out. I will get there, I'll get there.
And why didn't your parents take you to Shanghai?
Well, because I already had the permit to go to England, and they were told it's so terrible in Shanghai. And everybody just lived on, what you call it, from some refugee committee. They couldn't get any work, and they were hungry, and it was bad, and young people seemed to be worse off than, so they thought it might be better off if we take the risk. So we took the risk, and luckily.
So do you remember when your parents left?
They left 2 weeks before me, so that must have been about end of July, beginning of August. And I left middle of August, 39, that is. Yes.
So what was involved with, besides the fact that you had your friend in England to help you get there, what was involved as far as the visas, do you remember?
I had was sort of an aunt. She was still there, yes. She worked for the British Embassy still, and she sort of pushed through the visa. But I had the trainee permit that these people got me, and on the strength of that, I got the visa.
Did you have a sponsor?
I was just over 16, so I couldn't go as well, whatever you call it, a child, a school child. So this lady, where my friend stayed, she agreed to organize all that.
And did you have a sponsor?
Well, I suppose she would have been considered the sponsor. The whole organization, the Association of Professional Women, sponsored me, I suppose you would say.
And the woman's name that actually helped you?
Sarah Griffith. and she lived in Brighton, Sussex.
So when you got to England?
Well, I was to go to her place. I arrived at the airport, and the fella asked for my ticket. I could only speak about 5 words of English, and so then he spoke in German, and I was met by another friend, actually the neighbor that we had her mother and the girl. She was working, she was older than I think she had a job as a domestic. And I don't know what the mother did, whether she lived on support by the refugee. I'm really not sure. And they said, well, what's going on? Tell us, what's happening now? And I sort of, it's like a stunned mallet. I couldn't sort of think, but there I was in England. So I stayed the night with them. It was cold. It was only August, it was quite cold. And the next day I had to find my way to Brighton. They took me to the station and got, well, I don't know where I got the money. Well, I was allowed 10 shillings only to take out, but they may have, I can't remember the details, whether they had a ticket for me that was sent to me. Anyway, there I was on the train, and someone said something to me, and I said, I don't speak much English. I just arrived. They said, and how do you like England? So, well, I said, I don't know, I'm delighted to be here. And they met me then, and I moved into their house. And then it turned out there wasn't an actual vacancy for me, trainee permit. But she said I could go to school for a while and see what they can do. Sort of like domestic science, which I wasn't very into. But anyway, Brighton and Hove High School. And I learned English very rapidly. Well, being young and when you have to. Had a few problems, of course, with the language at first, but my girlfriend already spoke fluent English and didn't speak any German. And I think within 6 months I was pretty proficient at English. Few errors, of course.
So when you got to Brighton, who were you living with?
With third lady, Miss Griffiths, and my girlfriend. And over the months I was there until Dunkirk, you know, until the threatened invasion of England. And during those months she had sometimes as many as 6 refugees in the house. Not all staying permanently, of course, but temporary homes till they could find somewhere. And she also had my girlfriend's grandmother staying there. Yeah, I think it was quite marvelous when I think, would we take 6 refugees into the house? It was a big house, of course, and she was very well off. She couldn't have done it otherwise.
I just want to go back a bit.
Mm-hmm.
Your parents had left
Well, they
Vienna.
were by then in Shanghai.
Where were you staying? Vienna.
Oh, yes. Well, I went to another girlfriend, whom we were very close, and her father was another one. He said, I'm Czech, they can't touch me. So they were still there, and the 3 of them, there were 2 daughters. The parents and the daughter, they perished.
Do you remember the family name?
Rösler, that was Rösler. And the other girl came to Manila, where she had a cousin, whom I'm still friendly with here. So it's, you know, a network. So I stayed there with them. Actually, I even have a letter still from her. She wrote to my parents in Shanghai about my last days in Vienna. She said how brave I was. Not much choice. Yes, so that's what... and from there, this uncle, who was also then later transported, he took me to the airport and all that.
And do you remember how many people were with you together going to England on the plane?
There was only a small plane, 25 passengers, and I don't think there were any other refugees on. As far as I remember, it was just an ordinary business flight or whatever. No, there were no, as far as I remember. If there was one, I didn't get to talk to them. Well, we had the control, you know, luggage control. They rummaged through everything. Wasn't allowed to take out anything except clothing and 10 shillings.
So now you're in Brighton, in England.
Yes.
And you were saying that you were there, Dunkirk was going on. I just
Well,
want to know.
I was there from then, from the start of the war, or just a bit before, until Dunkirk was going on, after which the British government was worried about spies on the coast, and they said everybody had to leave the coast. I mean, refugees or not refugees, everybody, foreigners. And we were all converged on London to Bloomsbury House, which was the refugee committee. But yes, those few months, well, we went to school, learned English. She was a very strict lady, religious. Well, she was good, but she was very strict, so we didn't do anything except go to school and study, read a bit, go for walks.
And what about news from your parents?
That was sparse, but it came, because, yes, I was able to keep sort of in contact while they were in Shanghai. And also, well, then they got to Sydney during the war, and of course I was able to keep contact with them, yes.
Do you know how they got to Sydney?
Well, my father had, after he was refused a permit, he then, through the engineering world, he got in touch with different firms in Australia. And he finally found someone who said, well, I'll sponsor you, I'll give you a job when you get here. That was the other. Either you had to have money or a sponsor. And so this man sponsored him. But the war, of course, was already in progress, but from Shanghai he could still come. That was in sometime, yes, in early 1940. He came on a Japanese boat to Sydney.
Now you're in England, you were studying. Did you work at all?
Oh, I had no work permit. No, then I had no, there was no job, as I said, really. They just said there was somehow. No, I went to Brighton Hove High School for a term, and then they transferred me to a business college, and I learned, which was very good because I learned typing, shorthand, bookkeeping, and the shorthand helped me a lot with English because it's phonetic, the pronunciation. So that was up to Dunkirk. Then when we got to London, well, the refugee committee said, we'll give you £1 a week, but you must find work. And then, of course, you had no work permit, and it was a bit difficult, you know. You went there every week and queued up for the pound or whatever. And there was another acquaintance in London through my father, and he said, well, I could do some typing for him, but that wasn't a proper job, just the odd bits and a bit of pocket money. And they said, well, you really must find a job. And I said, well, how do I find a job? And I don't know how I found this fantastic job. It was in East London, stuffing dolls with straw. And long hours and very little money, less than the pound, 17 shillings. And even then, I couldn't quite manage to eat and live on 17 shillings fares and so on. So I went back and said, look, I can't manage. In the meantime, I had been writing to other people I knew from Vienna who somehow managed to survive and establish themselves. And so they said, if you come to the Midlands, you might have a much better chance to get a job. So I did. Well, I still didn't get a job until just after Christmas 40. Then I had a job for 3 months. And in the meantime, all these negotiations were going on about a permit to Australia and so on, and a passage, which wasn't easy because the permit would run out and then I'd get another permit and there was no boat and so on. But eventually it all came together and I managed to get on a ship. It was all very hush-hush. I wasn't allowed to write to my parents what ship, where, when, or even my friends, they weren't allowed to see me off. I was just told to come to a boarding house in London. It was like a real spy story. And so I went to this boarding house, which was pretty awful, with famous, ghastly English food. But anyway, I was happy. And then they told me where to go and meet the boat train. And
Who were the people that helped organize all this?
the refugee committee. Actually, this lady I stayed with in Brighton, Miss Griffiths, she offered to pay my fare. But the refugee committee said, we'll pay. So I said, thank you very much, but I can pay them back later.
And
so they paid my fare.
And while you were in England, what news were you hearing about Vienna? Or were you hearing anything at all?
Well, not really, because we were at war. Only what's in the papers and so on. I did hear indirectly, now I don't know how she heard that. That was before I left for Australia. One of my girlfriends, she said she'd heard from her parents somehow, they were in Czechoslovakia, and that they were going to be transported to Poland. She was very upset. I couldn't get them out. But how that came through, it might have been Red Cross already. I don't know how we got the news through, but it was very little. And of course, this girlfriend who helped me to get out had a sister who went to Norway because she perished and the Nazis invaded Norway, and that was the end of her.
So now you're at this boarding house waiting to come to Australia. Do you remember what time of year, what month?
March, early March.
And what year was
41.
it? So how long did you...
I was there about 7 days. They said I had to stay there till they contacted me, and then they did. I had to go to one of the big London stations, I forget which one it was, and there was the boat train.
And do you remember any particular person, any names at all?
No, I don't. I mean, it was sort of impersonal, really. It was, I don't remember, you know, these people at the refugee committee handled thousands of, it wasn't always the same person. But I do vaguely remember that my friend managed to get to the station, so maybe I was allowed to say what station I was leaving from, because they came and said goodbye.
And so now you're on your way to Australia.
Then got on the boat, and I loved it. It was wonderful after, it really was. Except there was one chap, there were a lot of families returning to Australia that were stuck in England by the war, you know, they'd visited. And half the ship was full of troops going to Africa. And there was one gentleman, we sat at our table, and he said, well, there's one thing I agree with Hitler about, is getting rid of the Jews. And I said, yeah, I'm one of them. And then he got a bit sort of, he didn't know what to say.
I want to ask you too, in London, coming from Vienna as a refugee, did you incur any anti-Semitism there?
Not so much anti-Semitism, but anti-foreigners. And I was sort of, it was very much impressed on me how humble and grateful I must be for having, well, I was grateful, but you know, they harped on it, you know, how lucky to have got to England. Well, I was, but they did sort of overdo it a bit, and there was certain, and of course then it was war, which always whips up anti-foreign feelings. And even though, well, we explained we are refugees, but they didn't, not everybody did quite see the difference.
And besides your friend Judith, were there any other contacts with other Jewish people that you had there?
There were, yes, we did, well, there was a Jewish community there, and we occasionally attended functions and things there in Brighton. And then, of course, I knew a few other refugees in Midlands, not in London and in the Midlands, so we had a certain amount of contact, yes.
And what about as far as being Jewish? Did you still?
Well, I sort of, again, I had on and off, I had these feelings, but not really, not the religion so much, but actually I was asked if I wanted to go on one of those training things. What did they call that? A hachshara or something. And I sort of felt it strange, really. I would have thought I'd grab anything, but I sort of felt that wasn't me, so I didn't. But we had, I remember there was a Hanukkah celebration. We just joined in. My friend was the same as me, actually, exactly the same. She was one of, so, you know, we had a bit in common. But
So now,
and then I did work for a Jewish family. I think I told you that before. But that was before I got the job in a factory. And they wanted a house daughter, they said, to help in the house. It was a 2 or 3 story house. And I worked very hard there. Had to do everything. And she sort of realized I wasn't observant, and she said it was people like you are responsible for the rise of Hitler. I couldn't quite work out how she came to that conclusion, but and her husband was an Orthodox rabbi, but he didn't get himself involved much. And he was just, but she had a son and a daughter the same age as me. But I was only, it was almost like a fairy tale. I was given a camp bed with no mattress on it. This was bitterly cold, November. And they all had their dunas and so on. I thought if I tell anybody that would just stir up their anti-Semitic feelings.
I think we'll end this tape now. This is tape 3, interview with Toni Dawson. Now you're on your way to Australia.
Yes.
Do you remember how long it took you?
Yes, 7 weeks. We stopped first in Scotland and picked up a convoy. Well, picked up, it was organized. We went in convoy from there to the Gold Coast in Africa. Destroyer, aircraft carrier, battleship and so on. I met a young boy on the ship who was also a refugee, and that was his second attempt, he said, to come to Australia because they were torpedoed the first time. He survived, but they... So that was him. And then in the Gold Coast all the troops left and Air Force came on, and they stayed on the ship until we landed in Cape Town. And there they went off. We had 5 days in the Gold Coast, 5 days in Cape Town. And that's where the gentleman who agreed with Hitler about the Jews invited me to spend some time with him in Cape Town, and I declined the offer.
And what news were you hearing about the war?
Nothing. Absolutely nothing. So I just sort of settled back and relaxed and thought, enjoy the moment. I was very lucky to be out on the sea. Well, we were a bit uneasy at first about torpedoing, but from Cape Town on, that was April 41, there was no danger there much. So from Cape Town we went direct to Melbourne, stopping nowhere, and that took 3 wees.
And who met you in Melbourne when you got there?
Nobody, because I wasn't allowed to, you know, I wasn't actually allowed to tell anyone what ship I'm on. And I did know from before that my parents had left Sydney and gone to Melbourne. So I got off at Melbourne, and we knew a family in Melbourne. I think my mother had written to me that I'm to go to them. This family actually was our butchers from Vienna. They were Jewish. And they'd got here, they had 3 children. My mother was babysitting. One of those children became a lawyer and is a member of the Labour Party here. The others continued with the butchery. I think there's still a Redlich. You might have heard the name, Redlich Butchery. Well, that was them. So I had their address, we landed in South Melbourne on the docks there. There was an Australian family who told me I was coming to paradise. And then when my first sight of Port Melbourne, I thought this is a strange paradise, because in those days it was terribly grotty and there were drunks around. You know, it was really grotty. Anyway, they guided me to the trains and took me to the city. And there I asked how I get to this address in Caulfield. Said, well, you take this train, get off at Caulfield. It was called Caulfield North, but Caulfield North is really more east than Kilda. So it was a long way from Caulfield Station. Somehow or other I managed to get there in the end. And they were, you know, they nearly fell over backwards, and they saw me and they got my parents. And
so what
that
happened?
was a great reunion.
So what happened after that?
Well, they were very happy, but my parents hadn't, now wait a minute, this was May. Yes, he didn't have a sort of a regular job. He had a sort of something in a factory, on and off, and they had lived in furnished rooms, but I got a room there, and then it was job hunting. That was the main thing, to start getting a job and, you know, to live.
So what type of job?
Well, I had this typing and so on. I thought it'd be nice to get into an office, but at first I got into this factory, like I worked in England, sewing on those power machines, making uniforms here too, I think. There were something like that. It was a Jewish place too, and the boss showed me what to do. He kept on saying, see what I mean? See what I mean? Anyway, then I somehow, how I got that job, I don't remember now. It was a small engineering firm, and the boss was Jewish. Perhaps he sort of tried to help different refugees, got on to me, because there was the refugee committee here too. I think that's how it must have happened. So I got this job in the office, which was very nice. And we sort of, from then on, we sort of gradually picked up. There was here also bit of anti-Semitism, and again very strong anti-foreign feeling, suspicious of the war was on here too. So there was that, but nothing compared to what went on elsewhere.
And what about your father and mother? Were they working at all?
Well, my father then found a job just a few months after I arrived. He found a job with Australian General Electric, and there he stayed till he retired at the age of 70.
And your mother?
My mother worked a bit as a partly, for a little while she worked in a factory, both in Sydney, mainly in Sydney and then here, sewing. And then she just did dressmaking at home, you know, through hearsay, you know, you get people, that sort of thing.
And what about friendships? Did you make many acquaintances?
Well, first I met a girl in London who was also leaving for Australia on a different boat. I didn't think that many boats were going, but she was going a week later, and we arranged to meet. She was actually from Czechoslovakia. I forget, they had quite a big organization in England, of course being friendly aliens and so on. Anyway, I met her, and then the job I got after this one, I met another girl from Vienna, and she had lots of friends already, and you know, so she introduced me around. And
do you remember their names?
Well, that one was called Eva Klein. I've lost touch with her. I think she's still in Melbourne and still alive. She was studying chemistry. They were sort of fairly well off. They had money to come here, bought a flat house and so on. So they again were some of the very lucky ones. But she introduced me to different people. Well then, now how did this happen? You may have heard of the Dunera boys. Yes, well, a lot of them came to Melbourne, joined that employment company, and of course a lot of people, Jewish people, invited them to their homes, so I met quite a lot of those. And I also met some who as I think I mentioned before, we felt sometimes a bit guilty. Here we are, away from the war and everything. We ought to do something. We didn't know what. Didn't know what happened to my grandparents, whether they died of old age or in camps. I knew the other grandfather died before Hitler. That was well timed, I'd say. If you have to die, it was much better. He was elderly. And we didn't know, I don't know when we first heard, I think we got some letter through via Red Cross that one uncle, he still died in Vienna of sickness. So they didn't get him, but the other one was transported. We knew that. And that's all we knew. We sort of...
So being in Melbourne, what do you remember about the day that you heard the war was over?
I was in the city and I was nearly killed with the jubilations, you know, the streets were... Oh, well, it was... Everybody felt it was wonderful. And of course we had high hopes. Everybody had high hopes for a better world, which... Well, anything would be better than that, but as you know, lots of terrible things have happened since in various parts of the world. And that's the sad part, but that's human condition somehow.
And did your family then think of going back to Vienna?
No, they said they never wanted to go back to Vienna. Some people did, but I didn't want to go back to live there, but I would have loved to go back to, you know, really see what went on. And then they had UNRWA, you know, United, and I thought if I could just get a job with them, but I couldn't. So I didn't get back to Vienna till '66.
And how long were you there for?
A month.
And how did you feel?
Mixed, very mixed feelings. Bit uncomfortable. One way it was thrilling, you know, to childhood memories, or just Europe again, but very mixed feelings. A bit uncomfortable. More so actually in Vienna than in Germany, funnily enough.
So before you mentioned that you got married, when were you married?
Where or when?
When?
In 49, May 49.
And where were you married?
In Melbourne.
And what's your husband's name?
Alan Dawson.
And how did you meet him?
Well, actually I met him at the university. No, I also met him through another friend. First I met him sort of casually. I saw him a few times. You know, people get talking in the cafeteria. Didn't see him again, and then one day we had two girls staying in the house with us who also were studying, and a friend of hers came and said, "Can I bring along a friend?" That was Alan. So then we met again.
And was he from Australia?
Well, he was from England but grew up in Australia. He was about 6 when he came here, so he's Australian.
And what did he do for a living?
Teaching.
So where did you live once you got married?
Well, we lived for a while, continued in, that was a very big house. Then we got a little flat, and then people from England who owned the flat, they said they wanted it back. So we got another rented house, and eventually we bought a block first somewhere else, and very naive we were, we fell in. Some firm of architects took money and said that, but then they disappeared with all the money. So we sold that block and bought here, which was cheap, and we eventually built this house. It was all not sewered, you know, no roads.
And were you working at the time when you were married?
Yes, I was still working in an office, and worked till I had my first daughter, who was retarded. I think I mentioned that she had a brain damage, they thought, at birth. And sort of, while I had children, in between I did a bit of coaching privately, sort of little part-time jobs and things, until I went back to work full-time for quite some years.
And how many children do you have?
Well, I had a retarded daughter, and then I had 2 more, a son and a daughter.
And what are their names?
Philip Ian Dawson, and Jennifer Dawson.
And your first daughter's name?
Was Wendy Clare.
And Philip, what does he
He's
do?
a doctor in Tasmania. And when he's not doctoring, he's hiking and skiing. That's his main. He loves it.
Now it's been 52 years since the war.
45, so it is 52 years.
Do you think much about what happened to you?
No, to be honest. It comes at times, you know, suddenly you think back. But on the whole, no, there's been, you get busy and involved with your life. And you know, they always say you can't live in the past and it's not good. But of course I remember, and every now and again comes back. But as I say, being fortunate enough, never having been in a camp, it probably didn't affect me as much. But it certainly changed your life. But my friend, the one that I stayed with the last 2 weeks in Vienna, well, her parents went to camp and were perished. She never came to terms with it at all. She became very, I don't know, she just couldn't cope with it all her life. And she became more and more sort of hateful, even to the young Germans. Now they're all criminals, and, you know, and sort of very, very uptight, which was a pity for her, really. She died last year.
Is there anything else that you wanted to say, or is there anything that you can remember else that we haven't mentioned before?
About what happened, well, I can't think of much just now. I just thought that, you know, after the war everybody felt it'll be a different world, different life, but it didn't take long before we had strife here and strife there. I wish people would remember that we are all human beings with the same basic needs, and throw away all this prejudice. But I think it's a pipe dream, I'm afraid. We got to keep trying and hoping.
I want to thank you.
You're welcome.
And what is this document?
Well, after the Germans came into Austria, they started, first of all, a sort of campaign of minor harassment, apart from other things, like everybody had, non-Jews had to wear a swastika, and they decided every Jewish female had to take the name Sarah, and every Jewish male had to take the name Israel, and then they issued these certificates saying we had done. So I had one, my father had one too, but this is my mother's.
And do you remember when, around the time?
I think it was a few months after March 38, around, yes, I'm not exactly sure, but it was fairly early on, because worse things went on later.
And what actually did it state?
Well, it says the Jewess Alice Messing has this day taken on the name Sarah, and or something, you know, certified at some office.
And who is this a picture of?
This is a picture of my father in 1934. He was sent by the firm to, this is in Potsdam near Berlin, and of course Hitler was already in power in Germany, but not in Austria, and he came back, said, I didn't see anything, nothing much is going on. He was the one who didn't want to leave either. At first he said, it won't be so bad. He saw no sign of anything, he said. But then I suppose he wasn't taken anywhere much either, just to Potsdam, that's a castle, I think, isn't it? And the firm, the offices, so. But anyway, that was, he probably wanted to believe that, I think.
And who is this a picture of?
This is a picture of my mother, and this is her passport photograph before emigration, rather, and it shows the left ear. That was one of the minor sort of harassments. Every Jew who was emigrating had to show their left ear on the passport photograph.
And did you know why?
No, of course not. We weren't told, and we were not to ask.
And who were these two people?
And this is my mother again on the right, and my father with her. This was in 1950 here in Australia.
And where
somewhere in the mountain, in Sherbrooke Forest or somewhere. Had an outing. There.
And who is this a picture of?
And this is a picture of my mother's brother taken in an Austrian army uniform before the First World War, and he was in the war.
And what was his name?
Maximilian, but Max for short. And he was the only one of the family who was unfortunate enough to be sent to extermination camp.
And do you know which camp?
I think it was Auschwitz, but when I looked through my papers I couldn't see, I don't know where I got that from, but it was, well, he was, anyway, he perished rather horribly like millions of others. But at the time, you know, people thought, oh, anyone who served in the army, they might go easy on them. That was a bit of an illusion, of course, but anyway, that was him.
And who are these two people?
The man on the right is my mother's cousin, and I included them because I was the only relatives I was fairly close to, and they migrated here and lived in Sydney. And Annie, his wife, taught me to knit on machines. That was part of, you know, retraining in case I needed a job like that.
And when was this taken?
This was taken just after the war.
And
I think that, I don't know if there's a date on the back there, but it must have been after the war, because during the war I never saw them. We couldn't travel, you know, from Melbourne. We weren't allowed to move around. Yes, one thing I forgot, we had to report, as foreigners, we had to report every week. And if we wanted to move out of Melbourne, we'd have to get permission.
So where was this
But
taken?
this was taken in Sydney, so I think it must have been from 46, 47 onwards. He ran a chicken farm. He didn't know anything about chickens, but he managed. And she ran this little knitting factory. And in Vienna, they were the only people we did see a lot of in Vienna as well before the war. Both dead now.
And who are all these people?
Well, this was a group we formed. The initiative came from these Dunera boys who came to Melbourne and thought we ought to do something to help the anti-Nazi movements, and we formed this. They were all refugees from Austria, young Austria, but of course emphasizing the fact we were all refugees and anti-fascist, and we attended different functions and gave talks to different groups. And this particular photo was taken in a Melbourne town hall in 1944, I think it was called a brotherhood dance. You know, there were other national groups here, Friendly Aliens and so on. And it was sort of a getting together with all the different groups and celebrating brotherhood.
And where are you in this
And
picture?
I'm in the front row, the second from the left, with the very dark outfit. Wasn't quite as dark, I thought, you know. And next to me on the right is a very close friend, and the man next to me, he was one who did go back to Vienna, and he thought he'd fight for an anti-fascist world in Europe. I don't know how far he got, but he still lives in Vienna, still alive. And all the others, some are dead now, of course, but they all made a life here and did all right.
And who are these two people?
Well, the lady on the right is that girlfriend who helped me to get to England. She came out on a children's transport and then asked around everywhere, could people help get me out and a few others. And the lady she stayed with, Miss Griffiths, then organized for me to come to England on a trainee permit. So if it hadn't been for her, I probably would have finished up in Shanghai, which is still better than not getting out. But so I owe her a lot, really.
And who's the gentleman?
And that's her husband. He's a retired professor, also from Vienna, very bright fellow. Yes.
And where was this taken?
This was taken in England. I'm not sure where I think we might have been at a restaurant with them when we visited there. maybe in 70, or I don't know if it's got a date, but we had several visits to England, and I always went to see her. And I'm still in touch with her now.
And who is this a picture of?
Oh, this is Alan, my husband, just about, I think, 2 years before he died of cancer, and whom I told you I met first at the university, and then through a friend of a friend who brought him to the house in 49. We were married in 49.
And where was this taken?
Here, right here. Actually, that picture there behind him is that one on the wall.
And who is this a picture of?
This is a picture of my youngest daughter. The man in the background is a friend of ours. We were at his house, and this was taken in Warren died 2 years ago when she was here on a visit, short visit. And she lives in Wales. She was a ballet dancer, and then she never wanted to do anything but dance. But then she got too old and she didn't want to teach, and she was unemployed, and she joined one of those access courses, and she's just finishing that now, sort of environmental studies, and what will happen then we don't know.
And her name?
Her name is Jennifer. She never married. She had a couple of relationships, but they didn't last, and jobs, she could never settle. She's a very restless spirit. But so far she survived, and she's seen a lot of the world. She's been all over the world. So we hope she makes it still.
And who are these people?
That is my son on the right, my son Philip, and his wife Pam. And this photo was taken just a month ago when we were visiting them in their Tasmanian home. And what are they doing there? They're playing Scrabble. And he's a doctor there. He is in a group practice in Georgetown. I had another photo of his, but I thought I'd better not. It doesn't really come into this, but was taken when he graduated, and he was the top male student of his year. But the 3 top students were girls.